Welcome to our presentation on white box testing. So what is white box testing? White box testing is essentially going through your code line by line to identify bugs. We can do this in a team or individually. The way that I like to summarize this is it's kind of like the rubber ducky method. You'll go through it, again, line by line, and explain it so that you can understand it and identify bugs. Some synonyms of white box testing are logic-driven testing, design-based testing, open box testing, transparent box testing, clear box testing, glass box testing, and finally structural testing. This figure shows what white box testing is all about. First, we need to do a risk analysis, develop a strategy, and have a proper test plan so that we can eventually execute test cases that help us to find our bugs and fix them. This will result in us having a better understanding of our code and having a more error-free, more secure product.
This is a slide of the different techniques involved in white box testing. So for example, we have control flow testing, branch testing, basis path testing, data flow testing, loop testing. These are all different techniques that one can use when applying white box testing at different methods of doing so. So for example, branch testing is going through and evaluating each branch, each conditional branch that could be executed. Loop testing, on the other hand, is going through and testing each loop to ensure that the start and end places are correct and that what's going on in the loop is happening correctly.
In this case, we focus on white box testing. So consider now this other function called fun. And let's assume that we want to test this function without having a specification, so without knowing exactly what it needs to do, but just by looking at the code. So what we will try to do probably in this case is to try to just execute all the statements in the function. And notice that we'll talk extensively of what does it mean to do white box testing later on in the next two classes. So if that's our goal, if our goal is to cover all the statements, any input will really do. So any test case will execute all statements in the code and will have a complete white box testing coverage for the program. Imagine that I now give you a specification for this function. And what the specification says is that this function inputs an integer parameter, param, and returns half of its value if param is even and its value unchanged otherwise. That means if param is odd. So looking at this specification, we can clearly see that the function fun works correctly only for even integers, and it doesn't work for odd integers because it computes half of the value of the parameter and returns it every time, no matter what param is. So this is a case in which white box testing could easily miss the problem because, as we said, any input will exercise the code. It's just by chance that we could reveal one that revealed the problem in the code.
White box testing has some great advantages and upsides. Here are some of the following. It reveals error in hidden code by removing extra lines of code. Another benefit that it has is that its side effects are beneficial to the program. For example, since you need to have an expert working on the code, very familiar with the code, since they get so familiar with the code, optimizations will be a lot easier to implement, and you will be able to develop test cases a lot quicker. One of its most important advantages that white box testing has is its maximum coverage. Since this form of testing is very detailed, it covers most of the code and you have the possibility of finding all the bugs in your code. Another advantage is that it allows for the developers to carefully describe all the details of a new implementation so that the code author can know if something is on the right track or if it's not.
There are a number of disadvantages that come along with white box testing as well. The primary disadvantage we'd like to discuss is the fact that due to time and cost constraints, only a limited number of test cases will be executed when performing white box testing. Because of this, there will be limited code coverage coming from those test cases. Additionally, not every project has clear specification and documentation laid out. And it is difficult while performing white box testing to create good, thorough test cases coming from an environment without good specifications and documentation. Additionally, in order to perform good testing, a highly qualified programmer must be involved who knows the code inside and out. Now, this can be an advantage and disadvantage because performing white box testing will enable someone to become very familiar with the code. And lastly, it is very costly to perform white box testing, both in terms of cost, money, and time.
So, when is white box testing effective? The first scenario in which white box testing is effective is when the user interface is missing or not necessarily finished. Because white box testing deals mostly with the code and making sure that the actual code works the way that it's supposed to, the user interface is not necessarily needed to do effective white box testing. The second scenario in which white box testing is effective is when testing needs to start early on in the development process. As long as the specification is in place, white box testing is effective from the beginning. White box testing is also effective when skilled programmers are available to do the testing. In order to make sure that the tests are done properly, a very in-depth knowledge of the specification and the code and the application are needed in order for that to work. The fourth scenario in which it's effective is when in-depth testing is needed. Because these testers are doing such an effective test, they know the code very, very well. They learn the ins and outs of the code and they know exactly what will make it work and what will make it break. Now, in some scenarios, white box testing is not effective. If the code implementation changes frequently, white box testing is not going to be effective because that changes the specification and how everything works. It's also not effective when it needs to be done quickly. Sadly, white box testing takes a long time and it's very costly, but it's also very thorough. And that concludes our presentation on white box testing. These are the sources that we used to do our research. Thank you.